Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to give one of the keynote papers to the Crossing Borders and Contested Boundaries conference. The following paper that I've put together for today works, I suppose, brings together a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last few years. That is to understand the processes of boundary making and the meanings of boundaries in the early modern period. So I'm going to begin with a brief discussion of enclosure. I think a useful starting point for us in terms of thinking about boundaries for good reason, especially the materiality of boundaries in the period. Before moving on to a discussion of two case studies, one concerning a boundary dispute in the manor of Ledwigan in Anglesey, and the second, which will be a slightly shorter discussion of a case of contested enclosure and boundary making, particularly dealing with a right of way across a former common in the parish of Beddingham in Norfolk. So we're sort of going from east to west here in terms of the case studies that I've chosen. And of course I could have chosen all number, but anyway, hopefully you'll find them interesting. So enclosure then, and next I will just share my screen before I forget to do that. I don't have a huge number of slides to show you, but just to give you something else to look at. So enclosure then provides us with a useful starting point for examining the physical character and social meaning of boundaries in the early modern period. There is an extensive literature on the extent and nature of enclosure. The subject has been of particular interest to landscape historians who emphasise the evidence of the physical landscape as much as the documentary record. They have shown the multiple complex processes and outcomes of enclosure, a history defined by local and regional variation and inherited customs and practices. This is an area that landscape historians and archaeologists refer to as antecedent structures, dating in some cases to the origins of settlement and the distribution of landholding in the open fields in the early medieval period. More broadly, enclosure is treated as part of an argument about modernisation and the shift from communal land use regimes to private property, culminating in the 18th and 19th century parliamentary enclosure movement, shown here on this wonderful aerial photograph of the drawing board landscape that's described by Oliver Rackham, cutting across and indeed fossilising the former remains of open field land beneath pasture. Histories of the large-scale enclosure of commons, forests and wastes have long argued that the consequences of enclosure were abrupt and devastating for tenants and commoners, for whom customary access and use rights were the basis of household and community economies. Matthew Johnson has discussed enclosure in the age of burgeoning capitalism as drawing new boundaries and new ways of seeing across the land. And this he interprets as a cultural as well as economic terrain. Nicholas Blomley has written about the gradual concretisation of boundaries across time and space in this period. However, a deeper local analysis of enclosure offers an entangled and often contradictory and open-ended history of landscape and boundary making. Enclosure was a practical necessity of farming, as Christopher Dyer has shown for the medieval period and Tom Williamson has shown for the medieval and post-medieval periods. Enclosure was also sanctioned, something that is often missing from the story, by local customary law, something I myself have explored in previous papers. Erecting physical barriers was permitted by local custom and often at certain times of the year. Enclosure was thus a flexible response to the farming needs of the present that drew its legitimacy from the past actions of previous generations. Viewed in this light, enclosures, hedges, fences, stone walls, ditches could be fixed or open in accordance with a calendar year. The shifting seasons, particularly from summer to autumn, led to specific forms of unboundary making. The structural form and materiality of boundaries could be flexible, therefore, and at times ambiguous. Less obviously visible boundaries would be solidified at particular times of the year. This insight opens up interesting possibilities for a much broader discussion on the character and meaning of boundaries in early modern landscapes. The fact is that we're looking at landscapes that were not fixed and static. Rather, they were somewhat fluid, often contradictory, contingent, ambiguous. This is not to underplay the politics of enclosure and the grave history that we all know about of disenfranchisement, dislocation, and impoverishment, but rather it is to suggest a more complex narrative of the history of boundary making and how boundaries were practiced by people living in the past. In some sense, there is scope here for giving back agency to tenants and commoners in making boundaries. It is a narrative that subverts in many ways the emphasis on change and transformation as being primarily achieved through top-down elite, external, as in the case of the Parliamentary Enclosure Act's intervention, and invites us to think instead about the everyday agency and negotiation at play in the ways people saw themselves in relation to the land and to their neighbours in making or unmaking boundaries. The sheer complexity of the microcosm of boundaries operating within local customary landscapes is extremely hard, though, for us historians to really grasp. Here is a wonderful map of Flitcham in Norfolk, just to show you some of the complexity here of the boundaries that crisscrossed an area of intercommon. Often boundaries were loosely defined by a stone here or a tree there, or a barrow, as shown here, Sweet Hills, which I've talked about before many times. In other words, often boundaries were identified as ordinary, commonplace features, yet crucially, they were known locally as intrinsic to the organisation of customary access rights and land use. They were known through everyday practices of living in the landscape, through which evidence of the origins of features and places in deep or ancient time was particularly important to the micro-organisation of local landscapes. The identification of ancient time was applied also to certain forms of enclosure. I'll just go to my next slide. While the subject of enclosure has come to dominate our thinking of the economic and cultural transformation of early modern landscapes, other barriers or demarcations to the human-animal world and their movements brought structure and good order to everyday landscapes. Boundaries were necessary to maintain good relationships between neighbours, as the old proverb goes. The boundaries I am interested in were not simply forms of continuous, impenetrable structures, they were gappy and intentionally so. Age mattered too. So new boundaries made within living memory held different associations and meanings than those inherited from the more distant ancient past. So here I have a wonderful map, and a rare map too. I have not come across this before, but showing the parish of Corston in 1599. And the map actually determines between land anciently enclosed, shaded in green, and land more recently enclosed, within living memory, shaded in yellow. So a distinction here is being made between ancient time in terms of enclosure and current or recent time. So a clear distinction was being made between new boundaries being made within living memory and those originating in the distant or the ancient past. Just as the concept of custom, as social historians, including Andy Wood, I'm sure we all know, drew upon past precedent in confirming or resisting the layout of rights. In a semi-literate society, custom also drew upon the tangible evidence of the past in the material world. The belief in custom, the idea of custom, the concept did not just reside in people's minds, it was also physically evident in the material world, in the upstanding or the material evidence of the past in the landscape. Boundaries were identified by sight. Of course they were, but in equal measure they were known through movement and bodily practices, which is what I want to focus on today. Bodily practices of seeing, moving or walking or treading out, to use a contemporary term, to have relevance for understanding the ways people in the past created and experienced landscape, how boundaries were made and remade, as well as perhaps unmade. Indeed, the archival record shows the importance of moving, observing, and interpreting the histories of local everyday landscapes, not in the romantic Wordsworthian tradition, but as practical everyday engagements of dwelling, which was as much about sharing knowledge, pursuing common action and dialogue with the past, as it was about individual purpose and need. The day-to-day movements of people through the landscape was a process of marking and claiming, of bringing together within local societies. In a sense, then, this is pointing to a contemporary ways of world building at a local scale. In this process, which was continual boundary making was central to modalities of movement and dwelling. Even rights of way, which we might consider to be open and flowing with traffic, to use Andrew McRae's term, were controlled spaces demarcated by sequences of gates to impede the flow or constrain the flow of human and livestock. Just one final point about the maps that we're looking at, and coming back to the point I was making about seasonal boundaries. After harvest, during the period in Norfolk known as shack time, the grounds shaded in yellow would be thrown open to the common herd. So common grazing rights still were still attached to these portions of enclosed land, which were expected to be thrown open after harvest. So gaps just made in the fences, or gates left open. Of course, by the end of the 16th century, the period that we're looking at here, the manorial lord monopolised grazing rights. So to turn then to my first case study, which is from Anglesey, and it looks at the ecological and societal consequences of moving a boundary. In accordance with conventional approaches, this landscape would perhaps more typically be interpreted as the outcome of enclosure and drainage. So 19th century enclosure and drainage schemes. I mean, it's a very regular pattern of enclosure being displayed here in the area highlighted in a darker line compared to the areas of piecemeal enclosure around and about. However, the process of boundary making was actually more complex than perhaps we might more typically think. And it ties into ideas around neighbourliness and maintaining harmonious relations between common groups. However, as we will see, this was also a hotly disputed landscape. Tensions were not the result of enclosure, but they were the unintended consequences of, tensions were not the result of enclosure, but rather the unintended consequences of subverting the flow of the river from its ancient course. So here we have the straight cut of the river Cerveni, which I will be referring to in a moment. Here we find the importance in this case of memory and knowledge produced through movement and embodied practices. So as part of the processes of landscape making and boundary making and remaking and unmaking, we find bodily movement and practices being absolutely at the heart of what we're talking about. So I've decided then just to focus on this case study to hopefully raise some issues here. So during litigation proceedings concerning the manor of Ledwigan in Anglesey in 1606, local men and women were called to give account of the history of the landscape in question based on their knowledge and experiences. The cause of contention concerned the demarcation of common land between the neighbouring townships of Skeviog and Barrow, and access rights to graze livestock, gather hay for overwintering animals, and digging turbs for fuel. The history of the landscape was encapsulated in the oral testimonies of deponents who described how long-term physical changes to the common had been caused since the flow of the river Cerveni was redirected, affecting them, their household economies, and local social relationships. Deponents reported that during the time of Henry VIII, the commoners agreed to cut a mere or a boundary ditch across the common to soothe tensions arising between the neighbouring townships. Some 10 years later, the landscape was altered again when the plaintiff's father diverted the river from its ancient meandering course into the boundary ditch. Deponents spoke about the marks and precinct of the old river, as yet to be seen about 30 roods from the arable lands of Ledwigan. 60-year-old labourer Thomas Jeffrey remembered being with the village elders when the story of the old river was explained to him, when, and I quote here, "in the company of diverse old men long ago they passed over some water and over some lower ground where the precinct of a river seemed to be. He did inquire the cause thereof by way of talk, and the same old men told him in these words, you do marvel at it, for the river of Cavenny heretofore had his course this way until it was diverted." Thomas Jeffrey's testimony reveals both the social and material context of boundary making. In this case, as I have found in many others, the political economy of memory worked to contest local histories of landscape, which drew upon everyday experiences of moving through the landscape, talking and remembering with others, and interpreting the physical traces of the past on the ground. Each generation lived in the landscape shaped and modified by the activities of previous generations, which demanded interpretation. Even neglect can be viewed as a deliberate act of misremembering and forgetting. In the manor of Ledwigan, apparently the neighbours agreed to make a boundary ditch across the common, and the ensuing complaints were not about enclosure, therefore, but the flooding caused by the diversion of the river and diminishment of customary ways of life caused by the subsequent changes to local ecology and landscape. People were well aware that landscapes constantly changed, whether due to natural or human processes, and in turn, weight was given to the constancy of memory sustained by handing on knowledge from old to young. For the inhabitants of the manor of Ledwigan, it was important to remember the course of the old river, for its imprint on the ground provided tangible evidence of an earlier configuration of landscape and social relations, and also ecologies too. There were ecological and societal consequences to moving the river. By redirecting its flow into a relatively small boundary ditch, problems had become a serious matter by 1605. Agnes Gruff, widow of 65 years, reported that she had known the place in question for 40 years, for she had long dwelled near to the same. She described the extent of local flooding when the dam made to divert the river was broken and quite overthrown by the course of the water, and thereby the water recovered his own ancient course again. She described how 40 years previously the boundary ditch or mere was a little channel over which a man might step to gather sedge and thatch from the adjoining grounds. But in recent times the ditch had become so great and broad that a horse could not cross without difficulty, and thus movement and access to the meadows was severely impeded. She went on to give her opinion that the diverting of the river and subsequent flooding of the meadow grounds, that she seeth and she heareth, that many others complain that they find themselves damnified by the said diverting. 92-year-old husbandman Llewellyn ap David could recall the river and meadow grounds when he was a boy, before the boundary ditch was dug. And he reckoned in fact, that if the river of Cavenny were suffered to run in branches as he hath seen it to his ancient course, and not hindered by stops, it would be very beneficial to the inhabitants on both sides. 76-year-old Owen ap Robert, a husbandman, also told the court how he saw the river break the dam and to flow once more to its ancient precinct. But the dam was repaired and once more the old river was kept from its prescribed course. So we see then various altercations coming to the court from the manor of Ledwigan. And we hear both in 1585 people record and again in 1605 periodic flooding of the watercourse and the attempt of the ancient river to return to its prescribed course being a matter of great concern, and because it caused flooding of hay and turfs, which were of course vital to overwintering stock and also the turf sources of fuel. This network of rights, which entitled local inhabitants to access the land to gather natural resources, served to connect individual households to the common community through the memories and meanings drawn from their lived experiences of being in the landscape. So this piece of evidence highlights the complex, entangled and contradictory motivations of boundary making or remaking, leading to lasting, perhaps unintended societal and environmental consequences. Earlier attempts at reconciling the differences between commoners by digging a boundary ditch have been undone by the actions of the Lord of the Manor. The rerouting of the river increased the flow and volume of water into the boundary ditch, causing the meadows to flood, and in some years the river to return to its ancient course. But its construction had long-term and no doubt unforeseen consequences in altering the ecology of the land. So the oral testimonies here and in many other cases offer fragmentary moments, which nevertheless show memory to have been a social and material process. We gain insight into different versions of reality, certainly in the historical record. The change in physical and ecological qualities of the meadows brought benefits to some, but not all. There is a sort of drying out of the land in some areas of the meadow, which was deemed to be a great benefit to those who didn't want their land seasonally flooded with the overflow from the river. Through this one story of the creation of a boundary ditch and stopping up the old course of the river, we find the works of memory and experiences of the landscape, and very much the embodied experiences of boundary making. The documentary record invites us to consider how knowledge and memories made through customs, but also rituals and everyday practices incorporated the landscape. While traditionally scholars have considered how marks or markings were transformed into a text, so the landscape becomes something that can be read as if it was a text. The result being that landmark features could be read as a repository of memory and thus a series of reference points for each generation. What we find here is, and following the work of Tim Ingold, to assume that meanings are inherited and worlds are made before they are lived in is an oversimplification of the ways people dwell in the landscape, how they create meaning and give context to everyday practices in the present. So now, thinking about marks and markings, and thinking about memory and embodied practices, I now want to turn to my second case study, which deals with the rights of way dispute in the village of Beddingham in 1605, where litigation concerned the obstruction of the common highway, and indeed the common also, which had been caused by the erection of gates and fences by the local owner of the manor, Mr. Stanhope. While enclosure was an accepted part of customary culture, as I laid this out in my introduction, it relied on the judgment and acquiescence of the community of commoners, tenants and commoners. Gates and fences out of place or out of season, as I've already discussed, caused tension and conflict. Deponents argued that since time immemorial, they had access rights to use the common and the common highways and lanes of Beddingham. A road known as Narrow Gateway was reputedly a common highway for all the King's liege people, they argued. At the time, local residents verified the longevity of its use by referring to its physical appearance and by calling upon the memories of elderly inhabitants and the common voice of the locality. Local inhabitants told the court that the ancient dikes or ditches by the sides do show it to be, and likewise, and the stones and gravel laid there do show that it is and have been an ancient highway, while the common voice of the people there, and especially of diverse old men, have known it so to be always. While the memories of village elders clarified access rights that had existed since time out of mind. It's the materiality of the road. The fact is that they're inspecting the material makeup of the road itself, its very texture and substance, was also so essential in proving its origins in the ancient past. So perhaps in some ways mirroring the ancient course of the River Keveni. Local grievances, however, boiled over. We learn that in 1605, we learn that at the time when grievances really boil over, we learn that at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, about Hallowmas, 4 or 5 years past, so going back to about circa 1600. Being then bright moonlight, local inhabitants gathered on the village green to witness a wager of 12 pence being laid down between Edmund Hilliard and Thomas Nicholson, which was that if Nicholson to go from Mr. Vesey's house to Edmund Hilliard's house, blindfold, being turned twice or thrice about, he should win 12 pence of Hilliard. James Nurse, husbandman, told the court that Nicholson confessed to him that in order to perfect his knowledge of the route, which of course he would be walking along blindfolded, he did make marks in the way, so he should know the same when he was blindfolded. Hilliard, realizing this, he must have had some insider knowledge here, Hilliard, realizing this, did go and alter the marks which he had taken, and did lay blocks, and turned an old cart across the way where it was plain meaning open. We learn that the blindfolded Nicholson, losing his way, did travel up and down in the highway until he came against Mr. Stanhope's house, where, being ready to fall into a hemp pit, he plucked the cloth from his eyes, saying he had lost the wager. Well, the case reads as highly entertaining revelry. It carries much deeper meaning when understood in the context of modifications being made to the local customary landscape by Stanhope. The occupation of the road at night time or the night season was an act of deliberate subversion of normal, orderly daytime activities. The attempt of Nicholson to move through the landscape blindfolded unsettled the senses, mirroring the unsettlement caused by the alterations made by Stanhope to the customary route, ways and ways of life. The obstructions laid in the road, including an overturned cart, both replicated and intensified the disruption caused by the gates and fences made by Stanhope. The end destination, Stanhope's home, was doubtless intended. Stanhope's son reported that when he went out to ask what they meant to be there at the time of the night, they answered that they would come and go at their pleasure. In the morning, he did see his father's gate thrown off the hinges and part of the ledges broken. This again is a useful case because it draws us again to think about the materialities and meanings of boundaries outside the enclosure paradigm, and embedding how meaning shifted from day to night. Like Ledwigan, we find how changes to the landscape impinged upon historic land use structures, which maintain the correct and customary order of landscape and community. In both cases, we are shown the complex microcosm of boundaries at a local level. Boundary marks and features were remembered and identified on the ground against the actions of those who would contravene customary and time-honoured rights. In Beddingham, the frustration the villagers felt was given material expression in their appropriation of the common highway, which they established as being ancient. It had been made before anyone could remember it. It was their right to be there. But outside normal time and outside routine practices, the lane was transformed into theatre, where the impacts of enclosure and the uncertainties caused by changes wrought on the customary known ancient landscape were staged. In Beddingham, common grievances were expressed in the night season, a time of customary quietness in well-ordered households and communities. Both cases reveal the politics of moving or walking through landscapes. Ordinary everyday movement had been obstructed. The people could no longer step over the boundary ditch in Ledwigan, and the imprint of the river was felt through bodily movement as people moved from one side of the precinct to the other. In Beddingham, the extraordinary events of the nighttime revelry further reveals the local politics of boundary making, and in this case, unmaking as performed through movement in the material landscape and the footsteps of the gathered assembly. The men of Beddingham unmade the actions of Stanhope, who was accused of erecting gates and obstructing the flow of movement through this landscape. So I haven't got a map of Beddingham, unfortunately, but here is one from Corston made by the tenants who were going through a similar set of grievances at a very similar time. So this map shows the stopping up of the way to Norwich by the enclosure, maze, and various gates erected in the landscape. So just preventing the flow of movement. Both cases reveal in different ways how the landscape was not simply a store of memories. Memories were made and remade through embodied practices, daily movements through the landscape, and through deliberate observance of material markers. Recourse to the physical evidence of the past gave material context to local memories. Indeed, for Thomas Jeffrey, the earthwork imprint of the old river was a wonder to behold. In Beddingham, we saw how local people interpreted the material qualities and structure of the lane to be ancient, while Nicholson laid out marks so that he could know the route he needed to take while blindfolded. But his efforts were thwarted by the actions of Hilliard, who obstructed his way, with, among other things, an overturned cart, sort of mirroring the actions of Stanhope in setting up fences and gates along the highway. Meanings were not self-evident, but were materialized through the experience of being and walking through the landscape, and often in company with others. When the important things to remember were told to those gathered to listen, the evidence shows how nothing was to be taken for granted. Mnemonics were not simply fixed, but needed constant recognition through routinized practices to generate meaning. So just to sum up there, for our purposes here, I have chosen to focus on the question of boundary making as part of a process of unmaking, if you like. Is hopefully a relevant discussion. In part, I suppose, thinking about agricultural landscape history, I think the documentary record really complicates the tendency towards linear, unifying narratives of enclosure and improvement and progress and the rise of private property. It gives those of us interested in everyday life, customary landscapes, social relationships in the period, a better understanding also, though, of materiality, of landscape, of movement, of everyday practices in the processes of making and remaking boundaries. So anyway, thank you very much for listening. I shall look forward to talking with you on during the conference.